All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful Wednesday. On behalf of Optiri, we would like to welcome you all to this webinar titled Zero Trust, Real Results: How Credit Unions Can Strengthen Cybersecurity in 2025. Today, we have with us Optiri's Chief Operating Officer, Shane Butcher, as well as our Chief Technology Officer, Hugh Smallwood, and our Senior Director of Security and Technology Consulting, Barry Lewis, who is also one of Optiri's virtual CISOs. During the session, these Optiri team members will discuss the fundamentals and urgency of zero trust architecture, outline the different paths credit unions can take to get on the zero trust continuum, and they'll showcase Optiri security solutions to implement zero trust principles. But before we jump in, we would like to go through a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to all after the session concludes. Second, due to the large attendance, the phone lines have been muted. And lastly, we want to hear from you. There will be a Q&A at the end of the conversation. If you think of any questions during the duration of this webinar, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box and we will do our best to answer. You can also answer yes to the poll that is on the screen right now, and one of our team members will reach out to you soon after the webinar concludes to discuss the topics within the session. Thank you again for being here for this Optiri webinar. Without further delay, here's Shane, Hugh, and Barry.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Hope you find this interesting. So first, we want to start off with another poll to see everybody's comfort level and knowledge level of the concept of zero trust. So if you could just take a second and click where you are on that continuum, and we'll share those results here in just another minute. So give everybody another minute or so, or another 30 seconds to vote. But again, I'd like to thank all of you for joining, and also thank both Hugh and Barry for joining today. They are experts on this topic, and so we'll do this in a question and answer sort of format and hear their opinions on these. All right, so we'll go ahead while everybody's finishing voting, and we'll go ahead and just start off. So all right, and let's see here, we got it. The results have just popped up. So we've got a few folks that are experienced. We have some familiarity, and then we've got about half of you that it is a new concept. So that's great. And so hopefully we'll be able to clarify these concepts and add some value of those for those of you that are experienced. All right, so Barry and Hugh. So we hear the phrase zero trust, frequently these days in the news, from vendors. Let's start with what zero trust is and really what does it mean? And Barry, you want to kick this one up?
Yes. So before talking about what zero trust is, we probably should address a few things that are common misconceptions that we get asked a lot. First, zero trust isn't a product or a service. It's not something you're just going to purchase and it's some package you can go buy and it's done. Secondly, implementing it doesn't mean starting from scratch. All of us are somewhere already involved or along the maturity model for zero trust. We've all done things that fit in that path or in that process. And lastly, zero trust doesn't create a really bad or poor user experience. If it's implemented well and with consideration and thought for how you operate and your needs and your users, then it doesn't necessarily provide a negative impact to your users. So now what is zero trust? As I said, it's not a product or a service. It's really more about the approach. It's a cybersecurity approach, and it revolves around the principles of never trust, always verify. Instead of assuming that anything on your internal network is trusted, that's been the historical model. Zero trust requires strict identity verification, authentication for every person and device trying to access resources on your network. The idea here, again, never trust, always verify, eliminates the idea of whether they're inside or outside of your network perimeter. So what that means to you is every user, device, and app has to be verified, regardless of where it comes from or how it accesses you. Access is always granted on least privilege, and only the specific resources need. You're doing continuous monitoring, watching what's going on in the network, reacting to it based on that. Validation, obviously, through that monitoring throughout the session, and having session controls in place. Encrypting data at rest and in transit, obviously, and doing some segmentation on your network, segmenting your network into logical subsections that VLANs, as most of you know, that you can control who has access to what and what systems can talk to each other. Protecting the data wherever it resides is without a doubt the primary thought of this.
No, that is a great intro, and that really makes a lot of sense.
The other part of it that I didn't include is third parties. The world we live in today, we're all heavily reliant on third parties for services, for processes, for staff. So vendor management plays a big part in this, because you have to make sure that your vendors are complying with the data privacy and standards and contractual obligations, protecting your data as well as you would.
Absolutely. All right, so kind of going through this definition of what it's not and what it is, there's really a lot to zero trust. So why zero trust, and why now for credit unions?
So why zero trust? In traditional security, I mentioned the inside-out approach, inside the network, outside the network. Typically, once a user's authenticated at the perimeter, they have access inside the network. It's pretty much a trusted user, trusted device. The problem with that is that once something's on the network, or if a user clicks on something that they shouldn't have or opens something that they shouldn't have, now that's trusted inside the network.
Mm-hmm.
It creates kind of the outside versus inside, where we're really looking heavily at the outside and not paying that much attention to the inside. Zero trust eliminates the idea of the trusted internal network, and really goes for treating everything as though it comes from an untrusted source on an untrusted network. Now, why now? Why now is really relevant. I think all of us have seen or heard some aspect of this before. Attacks aren't going away. They generate significant income for the attackers or other people involved in the attack. And I say other people because it's not just, some loner in their basement doing it anymore. There's an entire industry built around cyber attacks and around supporting those attacks. And I say supporting those attacks because there are people out there who provide training and how to do it. They provide tools. There's actually a SaaS vendor in the hacking world that offers their software with known vulnerabilities, hacks, and breaches already ready to go. And you can just contract with them to use it for a length of time or whatever. And there's marketplaces to sell, trade, buy data, and also tools. There's even forums where the attackers communicate with each other throughout this industry. It functions very much like a regular industry. And as you can see from the graph that sits to the back of this a little bit, and to the top, financial industry, the financial services, is second only to healthcare industry in the cost to us. That's average costs right there. So the average cost globally for a data breach is $4.88, almost $4.9 million. That's globally. If you take that back to just the US, it's just shy of 10 million is the average. And you can see healthcare dollar amounts is 9.77 million. Last year it was almost 11 million, so it's a little less this year for healthcare, but for financial services, it's still growing. That's growing year over year over year. And from the look of that chart, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere downward in the near future. So average worldwide cost, we talked about that. So if the average worldwide is 4.8, average cost for a financial institution is a little over 6. So it's another million just because we're in the financial world. And if you get into the lower level costs, like it's about $169 per record involved in a breach, that's compromised. But then it takes, on average, 194 days to even know there was a breach. And then another 64 days or so to contain that breach.
That's a long
So
time.
now you're out to, 2/3 of a year. And you haven't actually recovered from it. All you've done is identified it and contained it. So, the cost to that, the impact to your operations, not to mention any regulatory fines that might be there, or in recent experience, we've all seen the news and the lawsuits that have come out of recent credit union breaches. I believe there was one not too long ago where the first lawsuit happened within 24 hours of the breach being announced or the incident being announced. So there are significant long-term costs, short-term costs. Most importantly for all of us, security breaches are going to damage your reputation with your members, and that's going to hurt attrition. This is not going away anytime soon. That's why.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, the cost implications are huge, and just, the fact that we need to protect our members, really makes this make sense. So,
And if you think about
Go ahead.
Shane, if you think about where most of these, when you hear about these, where most of them come from, it's no longer, somebody, it is not as frequent that somebody, attacked a vulnerability in my firewall, or that there was a, external facing misconfigured vulnerability. Usually it is a compromised account. And so they're already in, so that whole zero trust theory says continue layering that trust and authenticate, trust and authenticate, and trust and authenticate. Make sure that you're limiting what those resources they have access to, only the resources and the information that they need, and throughout your application stack, continually verifying they are who they say they are and they're there for the right reason.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And even just doing some of the what we've seen with some of the risk-based, right? So even though we're continually authenticating, ramping up that authentication when the risk is higher. So if someone's traveling overseas or they're logging in from locations, I know we've seen the request for that and help folks do that. So, as we look at this in the real need for it, what's the first step to implementing zero trust architecture, and how can Optiri help with that? And how have we seen folks do that?
So thinking about that, about the easiest first step, it really helps to remember that zero trust it's not a destination. It's not a once and done. It's more of a maturity model concept. So when you're thinking about it, think about it that way. We're all somewhere along this path, along the journey, however you want to think of that word. And you've already started putting controls in place that fit into the model of zero trust. So the first step, the easiest first step, you've already taken it. Now we're talking about the next step. And before going forward with zero trust, my recommendation for everybody is assess where you are now in the zero trust maturity model. Assess what controls you already have in place. Find out how far you are along in identity management, or in data protection and third-party management or vendor management, however you want to word that. The model takes into account, identity and access management, device inventory and health, network segmentation, data classification and protection, security monitoring, analytics, incident response capabilities. So based on that assessment, you choose kind of what your next step is. So for example, most of us have implemented MFA to some degree. If you fully implemented it, great. If you haven't, the next step might be you actually require MFA everywhere, all the time, for all your users. and you might have stricter rules for or additional rules for admin or privileged use. If you haven't required MFA yet, that's a good next step. If you already have MFA everywhere all the time for every user, maybe moving on to like I'm going to use a brand here because it's the only one I can think of off the top of my head, but a YubiKey type of model or biometrics as a factor in your multi-factor instead of just a one-time code. And then and if you've already gone that route or you want to do something else, maybe segment your network. If you have started, if you VLAN wireless from the rest of your network, maybe segmenting the rest of your network out into some more logical segments to better protect data and restrict traffic might be your best next step or easiest next step. Hugh, anything to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. You kind of touched on it with the MFA. Really, that I would say that's table stakes. Run don't walk, run don't walk if that's not anything that you've tackled yet. And you mentioned the doing multi-factor across all areas, and it's interesting. We've seen a couple of credit unions already kind of just draw a line in the sand and say that they're across their entire application stack, they are only onboarding applications and using applications that will integrate with Microsoft through SAML or through enterprise application integration for authentication. So centralizing your authentication allows you to use those more advanced tools. So, you may buy an application that just has a username, password, database, and even though that's in your protected network, you really could mature your authentication by integrating it with an authentication provider like Microsoft. And I think Shane mentioned as well too that there are advanced tools even beyond multi-factor inside Microsoft security stack where you can model the login patterns, and you can risk base the login session and or risk rate, excuse me, the login session, and enforce additional security there, or frankly provide for an easier authentication. So re-authenticating timeframes may stretch out if it's a patterned login and an expected login, sort of providing not only more security but also a better user experience.
All right, great. So that, obviously a lot of options, a lot of ways to look at that. Is there a path to getting there and improving that level of maturity along that model that Optiri has seen other credit unions take?
Yeah, there is, and Barry really Barry kind of kicked us off with that by talking about the assessment. I mean, there's a ton of great tools out there. Obviously, NIST has a lot to say on zero trust authentication, so there is a framework and guidelines from NIST. If that's a little too beefy or a little too much to chew, I know they can use some big words there. Um, there is a zero trust assessment from Microsoft that's pretty well laid out. It does focus on the Microsoft ecosphere, but the concepts are all there. And this slide, I think, lays down the right path to the journey. Most of the NIST, the Microsoft one, align with what Barry's showing us right here, which is um, you know, the the journey, if you will, from the easiest areas to tackle to some of the more difficult ones. Obviously, vendor management kind of you should be looking at doing that in parallel. But if you start with looking at your, sound like a broken record, but it's really important. Your identity access and management, your Microsoft Entra ID, your Active Directory, your core login processes. Make sure that you're using multi-factor. Make sure that you have started to develop a roles-based access, meaning only the people that should have access do have access. A lot of times, we may put a file share out there in a folder called accounting, and you have good employees, and so no one ever goes into the accounting folder unless they have a reason to go in there. But making sure that that accounting folder is only limited to the resources that are supposed to have access to that folder is very important, and especially in the event of a breach or a compromise, making sure that you've really restricted the landscape that something could affect. The device security, you're next, you're kind of looking down at the individual devices themselves, or do those devices have the right access? To go back to the Microsoft one, and I'll keep hitting on that a little bit because I'm assuming we're all in that Microsoft 365 ecosphere, and we've all probably got some level of licensing that enables tools that we might not be using in the Microsoft ecosphere. So on the device side, there's you can marry Microsoft Intune with your conditional access policies in Microsoft and say, before I even authenticate this person, is this device that's trying to connect, is it trusted? Does it have the right endpoint protection software on it? Are things up to date? Moving up the stack to your network security, there's microsegmentation. Really put your infrastructure into areas that you can affect control. Don't put all of your applications, diving a little bit into the weeds, all your applications into one specific subnet so that rules are really broad, giving access to them. And I'd say, if you're already at that level, if you're still building firewall rules based on a source and a destination, you're probably not getting into that zero trust journey. Your firewall should be identifying the user as well, so you should be building rule sets in your firewall based on who the person is and giving them access with that taken into consideration. Another area that again, Microsoft has some really strong tools is your data classification. I know there's not a strong requirement at this point, but we are starting to hear um, interest from auditors in making sure that you have gone through the effort of doing data classification, understanding where the data you need to protect is in your environment, and making sure it's identified as such. When you go through that effort, there are a lot of tools where you can create rules based on the classification of the data. So a sensitivity label for data allows you to create rules in the Microsoft use their DLP rules or data protection rules based on those sensitivity labels. And then, up into your application security, there are third-party applications that can help in that area, but getting your third-party apps and APIs so that they're limited down to the resources that should be accessing them. Just spewed a lot at you right there. Barry, was there anything I missed there?
There was enough there. There's a lot of detail you can get into with each of these topics.
This is just the tip of the iceberg of the conversation.
Yes.
I think we just kind of took that journey with a Microsoft lens, but obviously there's a lot more in your network that you need to look at with using that same lens. Look at your stack.
Hugh, that's always one thing we can count on for you. The passion for technology always comes through, and when we get you started talking about these things. I do want to rewind back a comment or two ago, and you started mentioning seeing it, the data classification being required on from auditors, et cetera. So I'm going to kind of jump to exams and regulatory aspect, right? Is zero trust architecture being required from a regulatory standpoint and by examiners currently?
No, there is no regulation that currently requires zero trust as a thing by name. The NCUA has published a press release, I think it was a little while ago, stating that the agency itself adopted a zero trust architecture. NIST has also now issued a special publication about zero trust. So the indications are all there that, as is everything else that's come down the road for us as a new regulation, it starts out as a standard. The standard gets widely adopted. The FFIEC or NCUA picks it up, and suddenly we have a new reg. The fact that NIST put it out in a special publication, it will make it into a standard or a framework. And there is already some work on a maturity model for it. So as a reg, it will, I believe it will come, but there's not one there currently. Saying that though, all the specific controls of zero trust of that approach, they take all of the minimum requirements of the NCUA regs and rules and just enhance them. They improve them. So throughout the maturity model. So simple examples, we talked about username and password and then MFA. This is a simple one that everybody gets. That's a simple escalation. You went from usernames and passwords to also requiring MFA. And now you can do biometrics or something like a YubiKey or something like that. Moving towards passwordless. You can also, the idea of those instead of one-time codes is a huge improvement for compromised accounts. That helps a lot. And as Hugh mentioned, as of the last reporting, globally, compromised accounts are by far the biggest attack vector, with phishing right behind it. Yep. For initial ways in. So while it's not a requirement, all of the zero trust ideas are all just enhancements on existing controls we are already working on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And so as we look at it, you've mentioned a couple times that it's a maturity model. We've got stages of maturity. Does a credit union, really need to reach full maturity for that zero trust architecture to be truly effective for them?
No. Every credit union benefits from every improvement in controls that they implement. Some things, depending on how it's implemented, can have, a stressful impact. Let's be honest, we've all implemented changes that are tough to get used to, but controls always improve security. And in today's world and the world we're going to live in for the rest of our lives, there's no foreseeable way that gets better. Controls are always going to continue to increase, either in their intelligence, how smart they are, their automation, or how effective they are. So that's what we're looking for. Improve their automation, improve how smart they are, improve the protection they provide, and all of the things in zero trust. The model the approach is intended just to constantly allow you to grow and improve your protections across that whole spectrum.
Okay.
So they'll gain benefit from every part of it, every little step they take.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. So what about the size of a credit union? Does that impact the effectiveness of the zero trust architecture? And does a small credit union really need to implement this level of security?
The fact that it's an approach and not a specific product or a service means that the size of the credit union really doesn't matter. You're going to fall somewhere on that maturity model. Matter of fact, you already fall somewhere on that maturity model for every credit union that's participating today. You guys are all on there somewhere, whether it's at the initial stage or emerging stage. You're somewhere in that model somewhere, regardless of how small you are, because we're all doing the very, very basic parts of zero trust now. We just aren't mature enough along the model to do all the things that are in there, according to the possibilities. And they'll, just like every other credit union, they'll benefit from every improvement they make, regardless of their size. So simple things like adding MFA. That's simple.
Yep.
It's easy.
That makes sense. Okay. So, kind of thinking back to the slide when Hugh was describing all of the different controls and the paths that we could take, it sounds expensive, right? That's a lot of tools, a lot of controls. What are some of the ways to make it more cost effective for the credit union?
Most credit unions are probably using technologies that have functions that satisfy that framework that Barry was mentioning. Most modern firewall platforms, 48, Palo Alto, Cisco, even Sonic Wall, they have tools in them that can help you identify the endpoint, help you build policies and rules, as I said before, based on user versus the traditional, source address, destination address. Certainly, to keep on the Microsoft front, even if you're on business premium, you have access to building conditional access rules. Those conditional access rules can enforce multi-factor, can limit times, limit locations, things like that. And it's a fairly cheap upgrade to the additional, I think it's the Azure ADP2 to be specific, or Entra ADP2 license, but a very small license upgrade to start using some of those the risk-based sign-in rules there as well. So, most credit unions already have infrastructure in place, so it's not necessarily a high expense to some large security tool that's complicated to implement and pricey to maintain.
I would add to that, Hugh, another way to keep costs low is work with your trusted partners, work with experts or experienced people who've done this before, who've worked in these areas. They can provide the subject matter expertise, they can provide technical resources, because everybody knows that, having staff, sometimes you just don't have enough staff to do all the projects that you want to do. So, and all of this should be involved in your budget. All of these projects, if you're making significant changes here, these are all budget items. You're not doing this next week because you can do it. If you have licenses and have the tools, that's why the assessment we mentioned earlier, that's why one of the important things, know what your current state is, know what you already have and where it is. So
Yeah,
that would help keep costs down.
No, that makes a lot of sense to start where you are and start with what you have and expand that out. So as we look at this, what would be the time frame for a credit union trying to implement the zero trust architecture, and is there a way that they can shorten that time frame?
The time frame to implement it is dependent on their current state and what their next steps are. Remember, this is not a once and done. This is a continuum, a maturity model. The approach itself leaves a lot of latitude, and where you are currently depends on kind of what you're going to do next. So use what you have, use experts and experienced partners, simplify your tools, scrawl, don't add more craziness to the process. But if you're simply enabling MFA, you can do that through Entra ID and Active Directory, and you can do that very simply, very quickly. So take the time, do an assessment, make out a plan. Timelines for that, a month or two, typically you can get through an assessment and a plan. That depends on the size of the credit union, what else you guys have going on. During the exam period, or audit cycle, that'll take longer because we're all tied up during that. Then whatever your next step is, I have it listed as an initial implementation, but the real thing is what's your next step, not your first step towards this goal. And you should expect somewhere between 3 to 6 months on average. There's a few things, if you've never done network segmentation before and that's your next stage, planning that out requires budget because there's equipment involved or contracting work involved. And that could take upwards, of a year and a half, 2 years to get into place. And that's long and complicated. So really what your next step is, what you want to do is kind of where you are, but it doesn't have to be costly. It doesn't have to be huge to take the next step or what might be the first step in the plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Anything to add, Hugh, on ways that you've seen our clients shorten that timeline?
Um, it comes down to a lot of times to prioritization, and kind of I think going through the assessment exercise, even at a very high level, really will give you the insight to how much of this you've already considered and really support potentially in some instances backing up that it does need prioritization. Um, those initiatives at the top are usually on the shortest timeline. So um, I think starting and really looking at that assessment is what is going to help you tackle this in a time frame that's valuable and useful.
Okay, no, that makes sense.
And
All right.
and
Oh,
well,
go ahead.
when everybody's planning out their timelines or planning out their plans, keep in mind that the world changes as we go around and around. Attacks change, the rules and regs change, the credit union's operations will change. So make sure you're keeping that in your implementation plan and your plan for zero trust as well.
That makes perfect sense and is great advice. So let's talk a little more advice. So we've presented a lot of information. We've talked a lot of options, and given a lot out here for folks to think about. What are the best next steps that a credit union or anybody on this call can take after leaving this webinar to continue their journey down the zero trust path?
My suggestion is the next thing is read the NIST document. Read the special publication on zero trust. It
Are you trying to
has
put them to sleep, Barry?
has a ton of
I've read it.
Say,
information.
Yeah.
if you're a little bit more like me who focuses on too long didn't read,
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of the of Microsoft's Zero Trust Assessment tool. It's a great graphic. It hits, it is following that proposed guidelines from NIST, Microsoft. If you look at their, I always forget the name of this, so I wrote it down over here. Their secure future initiatives. They've really partnered with a lot of external resources in trying to guide their security posture with best practices and what organizations like NIST are trying to standardize. And so um, that tool, that zero trust assessment tool, is a great place to start. Will really get you that 50. If you look at the framework of it, it'll give you that 50,000-foot view of where do I start looking in my organization, at where I stand, and frankly where there are tools I may have existing, to start to make impact and change.
No, that makes sense. And I mean, back to
That
the NIST document there, I think that, having read that, in my spare time, I think it really gives a great overview and reinforces, how you started this off, right? It's not a tool, it's not a thing, it's a continuum, it's a concept, and it's, ever morphing. But I don't know if you want to kind of,
yeah,
jump on that too.
the other thing I was going to say is when you read that NIST document, don't think you're going to read it from beginning to end and just understand it all. Read it, hit the highlights, kind of pick out the things that matter or the things that ring a bell or make you think, and then look them up. Search is your friend, because they use words that I'm not sure in the English language, but they still are in there. So do that. Understand the concept, because it is a concept. There's no specific product that's going to do this for you. And then my next recommendation is assess where you are now. It's hard to plan. It's hard to know what to do next if you don't know what you have.
Yeah. And I think that Microsoft assessment is a great place to start, and even just, kind of doing an overall technology assessment in your environment. So
Yeah,
that's
and
great.
yep.
Anything else either you want to add before we jump over to questions?
No, at the
No,
moment,
no.
I think
Okay.
we probably should let people ask questions.
Okay. Thanks. All right. So,
All
Cassie.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so everybody here at this wonderful webinar, there is a Q&A box that you can click at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and you can go ahead and type in any questions that you have, and our team here would be so happy to answer them. I'm actually going to start us off though, because I know it might take a little bit of time for people to go ahead and put in this question. So something that I'm kind of curious about is how does a credit union determine their security priorities? Because there's a lot going on in all their types of responsibilities.
Barry, Hugh, which one wants to start off on that one?
So, yeah, we talk about prioritizing things all the time with credit unions, and it is a difficult process for some credit unions to wrap their heads around. But typically, it comes down to a couple things. You prioritize what you're going to do, what action you're going to take, what their next needs are based on the potential impact. If that thing isn't there, or if an incident happens that affects that, what happens if data is lost because of it? And then, do you have the budget for it? What's the lift? How hard is the work going to be to put this in place? Is it, 15 minutes of one person, or is it 6 months of the whole team? Those things all go into prioritizing those. But typically, it's about the vulnerability that is present. What's the risk? And that's what we're looking at. And we look at that from, what's the risk to the credit union's reputation? What's the risk to the cost? Is there a compliance risk? Are we out of compliance if we don't put a control or tool in place or don't take an action? So those are all the types of things that we look at with credit unions to judge the prioritization. And that takes involvement from, IT, but also typically people outside of IT and the credit union to know what the impact might be sometimes.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I do see one question coming in. Somebody's asking what systems might be needed to upgrade to implement zero trust architecture?
Not sure I
Yeah,
understand the
Yeah, I
question.
mean, I would say, certainly, your endpoints, right? Moving up to Windows 11 on your endpoints. Nothing specifically there, but making sure, thinking of the Microsoft ecosphere, there is added functionality to devices that Microsoft's targeting, some of these risk-based activities on, assuming you have, you're on the latest versions of their software. Your certainly in your firewall ecosphere, we know we work a lot with Fortinet. They are moving away from their SSL VPN offering and recommending a zero trust for remote access approach through some different configurations there. So it's not, I wouldn't say necessarily that you should go out and bulk upgrade your infrastructure. Certainly do the research. Look what functionality is in newer versions of some of your existing security architecture. Well, I guess to Barry's and Shane's point, first, familiarize yourself with the framework. And then when you're familiar with the strategy, look to what your platforms are capable of and what future versions. There's nothing out there that I can think of, and Barry and Shane, please speak up, that is a specific version of a specific piece of software that is restrictive.
No, I mean, I think,
No.
what we've seen, really gets more into, we've got these, like we've said, look at what you have. But even shifting some of the concepts, right, to zero trust network access, as we move that out, right, it might, whether it's not necessarily an upgrade, but kind of a shift of the functionality in your network stack and your endpoint stack and how it connects. Those sorts of things kind of, we'll need an upgrade or a shift. But yeah, to both of your points, I don't think there's like one upgrade that's going to take care of this.
I do think,
And
and I cut you off, sorry.
it's okay.
But I do think we mentioned earlier about the strategy of centralizing your authentication using something like a Entra ID, using SAML connection to Entra ID, or an enterprise application integration directly to Entra ID. There may be there is a strategy, and like I said, I've talked to a couple credit unions that are doing this, where they're saying, all right, we're going across our entire application stack, and if it doesn't integrate to that for authentication, we're replacing it. And when we look at new applications to bring in, if they don't support that, they're off the table. So, leveraging platforms or leveraging software that uses platforms that have stronger authentication tools, maybe an area that does require upgrade, change, or removal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to add, we talked a little bit about, we've talked a lot about Microsoft, but that's because as credit unions, we all live in a Microsoft world. We all have Windows systems as the primary workday tools, but their licensing is one of the things that is possibly going to have to be upgraded as you go along, because they base a lot of functionality on the licensing models. So depending on your Windows licensing, you might have access to Defender, and depending on the license you get, you could have access to different functionality within Purview and different things across their spectrum of tool sets. So most products and platforms, like he was mentioning, Fortinet and a few others, almost all of them have some licensing model like that, where you can, for an elevated license, do more things, have access to more functionality.
And don't think that means you have to run out and buy the $50 a month, $60 a month Microsoft E5. There is some really effective licensed cocktails that you can mix together in the Microsoft world for a much cheaper price than that license, and still get a lot of this advanced security.
That's
I love that imagery
good place to use a subject matter expert for Microsoft licensing.
Yes. Get your Microsoft mixologist. There we go. All right. Cassie, do we have anything
Yeah.
else?
I'm not seeing any more questions come up. I know that was two pretty good ones. So if
Yeah.
you guys are good, I'm good to close this webinar out.